Hello, this is Michael Anton. It's been a while since I've been with you. I am a lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, and also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and an occasional ad hoc, no schedule podcaster for the Claremont Institute with occasional ad hoc guests, one of whom is returning to his second appearance with me, and that is Professor Michael Millerman of the Millerman School, of which I am a happy student, having taken only one course so far, but looking forward to more. It was a refresher for me on Plato's Republic, highly recommended. There are other courses, including books that I haven't read or books that I have read but did not understand, including Being in Time by Martin Heidegger, which I think we will discuss in what is coming. So the last time Michael and I were on, we discussed at some length Leo Strauss's great Thoughts on Machiavelli, which I personally consider Strauss's greatest work. It's certainly my favorite of Strauss's great works. We wanted to talk more broadly, I did anyway, about Strauss this time. And I was prompted by something that Michael wrote. It's a fairly short, small essay on why early 20th century German philosophers, including Strauss and Heidegger, are still relevant to the conversation today. It's also a meditation, an argument as to why, as distinct and maybe separate philosophy and politics seem to be, they are in fact inseparable. You can't really have good or sound politics without philosophy. He makes this argument. I've always believed that, for the simple reason that to do anything in politics, you have to know what to do, or you have to have some idea of what to do, which means you have to have some idea of the nature of reality, better and worse, right and wrong. And you can't have that without philosophy, or at least without an implicit philosophy. So even when acting in politics, if you think you're not being philosophic, there is some unthought through presupposition that you're acting on that was informed by philosophy, depending on how far back you want to go. And I also wanted to raise the following question, which Michael and I will explore. I read his Twitter feed, so I have some idea of where he comes out on the political controversies of the day, whether it be COVID restrictions in Canada or geopolitical events in Ukraine and such. And it's safe to say that he and I are pretty well aligned on major political questions of today. And we are definitely both followers and admirers of Leo Strauss. And I want to bring up the fact that a lot of people on whatever you want to call it, the new right, the dissident right, who align with Michael and I about this or that political question. What's going on right now? What do you think of this? Do you agree with X? Do you disagree? You know, they're with us, but a lot of them don't like Strauss, or they think Strauss is bad, or they think, you know, Strauss is a neocon. Strauss gave us the Iraq War. This guy's a corrosive president. Anybody who follows Strauss is bad. So, you know, and so on. And I definitely think that's wrong and misguided, and usually the product of ignorance of what Strauss actually wrote. And I assume Michael agrees with that. And I wanted to explore that to kind of defend Strauss from people who get 2022 right, and to show, to tie it back to what I said at the beginning, that when Michael talks about the necessity of a sound philosophy, or just of philosophy itself to inform politics, that Strauss is actually a great guide to present politics. In fact, I come out where I come out, and I would bet that Michael would say the same thing of himself on so many political questions of the day, based on my reading of Strauss and on the books that he taught me to read and interpret. Right? It's how I see the world through that lens, and it is that lens which does not bring me to, you know, neoconservatism understood as crusading foreign policy, or to the tyranny of medical experts pushing vax mandates and lockdowns. I come out the opposite way precisely because of what I believe I've learned from Strauss. All right, I'm done with the introduction. I'm going to turn it over and hear what Michael has to say on this, and then we'll get the conversation going.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. And you're right that we do agree on Strauss's importance, on the mistaken interpretation of him by his detractors on the right. I think both the neoconservative concern and some other related concerns are off the mark. You can kind of understand how they got started and why people bought into them, but they are smoke and mirrors. They don't tell the full story. They don't even start to tell the real story. And hopefully, as a consequence of our conversation, people who had been hesitant in turning to Strauss can start to see the value of doing so seriously now for the first time.
Well, so let me say something, because I'm a little older and lived through what I'm about to talk about that may help explain how Strauss got so identified with political neoconservatism. So first of all, I spent a lot of time with Harry Jaffa, who met Strauss, I think, for the first time in 1948 and knew him, and spent 7 years with him on almost daily contact, and then knew him for the rest of his life. There's a lot of controversy about Strauss's politics. That is to say, what were his specific politics in the order of the day? We know that in the way he lived his life, he was personally very conservative, very austere, very modest, not any kind of bon vivant or hedonist in any way. Lived within very limited means and seemed completely content to do so, like Socrates in a way. I've heard from people that he was he was fairly Republican and conservative, and then he was a liberal Democrat. I don't know what to believe. I do know that Jaffa, of course, famously got involved in the Goldwater campaign in 1964, which did anger and alienate some of his friends who were Strauss's students. In particular, Alan Bloom thought Goldwater was way too right-wing, and he was disappointed, even upset at Jaffa for getting involved. But that Strauss himself didn't have a problem with it. In fact, was happily accepted Jaffa's invitation to move to Claremont in 1968, so 4 years after the Goldwater campaign. Also, one of the Strauss's few direct forays into politics was a famous letter that he wrote to National Review, I want to say in 1957, but it was in response to an article in National Review that basically took to task the Israeli state for its socialism and its planned economy and the collective farms and all of this stuff. So it's from kind of an economic libertarian rightist perspective, and said this is basically not a conservative state. And Strauss wrote a letter, a very moving and eloquent letter, in which he described all of the ways in which the state of Israel, in fact, expressed conservatism by taking tradition seriously, studying the Bible and the Torah seriously, protecting ancient people, and all of this. And it's a wonderful letter, and it sort of shows the limits of a kind of narrow economic understanding of conservatism. Where Strauss's point was, he didn't even dispute, if I recall the letter correctly, the charges about the economic inefficiencies and of the Israeli state. He just said, if we're going to understand what conservatism is to be, it has to be bigger than that. It is widely agreed, however, that Strauss, his last vote for president was 1972, and he did vote for Nixon on essentially Cold War grounds. I mean, this is a point in which the Democratic Party under McGovern had made a fundamental turn away from its support of a Trumanite policy of containment and even of pushback when necessary against Soviet expansion. And Strauss is pretty clear in his writings, even in his philosophic writings, that he was always opposed to the USSR and always believed that the West had to stand firm against the USSR and communist expansion. So where the neocon comes from is, first and foremost, some of the people Strauss trained or who had tangential connections to him ended up being prominent neoconservatives in Washington. And I say tangential because people like to point to, let's say, Paul Wolfowitz, who was not really, he took some classes with Strauss in the late 60s, but was not a Straussian properly so-called. His dissertation advisor was Albert Wallstetter, one of the great foreign policy realists at the University of Chicago in the 20th century. And there are a few others, namely Abe Schulsky, who was a Straussian and did write his dissertation under Strauss's supervision. But I tend to think that the whole question of Strauss as godfather of the neocons is oversold. So now we get to something personal. That is to say, I was in the White House in the National Security Council in George W. Bush's first term. And so this is the Iraq War, first Iraq War, March of 2003. Around May of 2003, James Atlas, a New York Times Magazine writer, one of the more prominent ones, who had written an incredibly favorable piece about Alan Bloom when Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind in 87. I think the Atlas piece came out in 88, but anyway, around that time. So this is a guy who'd been around the Straussian world and knew something about it, and nonetheless wrote an enormously stupid piece in the New York Times Magazine in 2003 saying that Strauss is the gray eminence behind neoconservatism and this plan to remake, the Middle East as democracies. And the piece just did incalculable damage to Strauss's reputation. It was almost entirely wrong in every way, and yet it got picked up everywhere to the point where I think Tim Robbins even wrote an off Broadway play about Leo Strauss being the, think of the metaphor on the cover of The Godfather, the guy holding the marionette strings and telling Wolfowitz and all of these people in the Bush administration, go invade the Middle East and make them democracies. I would say as an aside that it didn't help that Bill Kristol, who's definitely is a Straussian, trained by Harvey Mansfield at Harvard, who's another one of Strauss's informal students, Mansfield that is, that was a big cheerleader for this war and helped associate Strauss's name for it forever. But I would commend, and here I'm gonna say one more thing and stop. People, go back and read in the Claremont Review of Books an article by Tom West, one of my now colleague and then teacher, who trained by Jaffa and by Strauss. Tom West knew Strauss when Strauss was in Claremont in the late 60s. And West lays out the case that it's all nonsense, that if you actually read Strauss's works, the foreign policy views that he expresses, to the extent that you have to glean them out of his interpretations of other works, are in fact very moderate, very cautious, very much in keeping with an older understanding of the necessity of restraint and of the unwisdom of a kind of crusading folly through arms overseas.
So that's a very helpful background on the article and on the connections and things like that. Something else that I think is helpful, I invite people to consider. First of all, there's always the problem inherent to the relationship between a great teacher and his students of whether you can infer what the teacher taught on the basis of what the disciples do or say. That's a problem, I think, that belongs to the nature of political philosophy as such. It's the theme, in some sense, of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, where even his close disciples and companions get his teaching wrong, and he has to shake his head at them several times. So the fact that that's a problem in and of itself should caution us against inferring from Strauss's students, even if he did have, let's say, close students serving in problematic positions from whatever perspective. It's still not sufficient grounds for deciding about Strauss's own teaching. And, Strauss wrote about Heidegger, for example, that, okay, Heidegger also had some problematic associations, and we can't ignore them. And these are much worse than anything imputed to Strauss's students and the neoconservatives, I would say. But even for Strauss, Heidegger's political associations afford too small a basis for the evaluation of his thought proper. So we're always directed on Strauss's own terms, I think, rightly so, again, in my view, to what we can learn from the man himself. And even the question of Strauss's politics, it can be a question, like what were Strauss's politics, what were Nietzsche's politics, what were Heidegger's politics, what are mine and yours and all of that. That's a question that people can consider, but somehow it's not a substitute for the other question, what can we learn from Strauss, regardless of what his politics might be? So the tendency to draw the conclusion on the basis of New York Times articles, which are, that can be however helpful or harmful a substitute if someone needs a shorthand shortcut. But there's really no shorthand shortcut in the best case with Strauss or any of these other thinkers. You just have to read them. And I think that if people were to do that, they were to turn to Strauss and just start reading him and not about him, it would be hard to put questions like foreign policy, expansionism, and whatever else they impute to him at the center of attention and make it the heart of concern. Because as you know, and as people know who have read him, that's not at all the central issue. So the task is really to remove, just like Strauss had to remove certain objections that stand in the way of our study of the great texts of the history of political philosophy, we also have to remove some of the obstacles in the way of turning to Strauss. So this is a good conversation to start to do that. Certainly these issues don't stand at the center of his own concerns.
Well, the most important thing you said there, and all of it was great, but the most important thing to me is you just have to read it, right? That's the heart of the matter. You can't take other people's word for it with regard really to any author, but a thinker of Strauss's caliber, of his depth and profundity, you have to do the work yourself. And even then, you may never get to a full understanding. I think you quoted the other day, a line of Strauss about Heidegger, and it was to the effect that Heidegger believes that nobody, even the people who think that they're his closest followers, has really quite understood him. And Strauss says, I believe he's right, because it's just that difficult. Well, we ran into, I'm speaking for Claremont Institute now, one of our concern trolls got on our case not that long ago, a few weeks ago, over this question of Carl Schmitt. Now, Carl Schmitt, similar to Heidegger in the sense that he was a German 20th century political philosopher of a lower rank. I would think you would agree with that, of much lower profundity. Well, at any rate, I can understand Schmitt and I can't understand Heidegger, but that's my own limitation. At any rate, who also joined the Nazi Party for a while, and so is therefore in ill repute, deservedly, for having done that. And yet that doesn't necessarily obviate whatever might be true, valuable, or even wrong, but nonetheless significant in his thought. And Strauss himself read Schmitt, knew Schmitt personally, corresponded with him, and encouraged his own students to read Schmitt, just as he encouraged his own students to read Heidegger, for the philosophic import of his thought. So I find it frustrating and frankly just illegitimate and silly when people say, you shouldn't read this book, it's bad. You shouldn't even note that there could be anything correct in it. I mean, Strauss himself, in a famous quip that became famous that most people don't know came from him, said in Natural Right and History, he coined the term reductio ad Hitlerum, the definition of which is a view is not refuted because it happened to be shared by Hitler, right? If you want to be a serious thinker, you don't say, well, I don't need to pay attention to that because X believed that or Y said that and they were bad, therefore the thought must be untrue. You have to actually do the work and read the thinking yourself and think it through. At the end of the day, Strauss's opinion of Heidegger is much more complex than his opinion of Schmitt. Strauss's opinion of Schmitt is that he respected him as a serious man, but someone who, at the end of the day, tries to find a way out of the impasse of late modernity. And Strauss believes that he, like so many other modern thinkers, he just ends up in a trap of radicalizing the certain modern presuppositions. And it's something that Schmitt himself all but acknowledged later in saying that nobody understood him. That is, Schmitt is saying this of himself. No one understood me better than Leo Strauss did. And he said at one point, he said, he saw right through me. He x-rayed me, right? Whereas Strauss's opinion, but Strauss couldn't have done that without doing the work. And then he demonstrates it in writing. His view of Heidegger was much more complicated. I think, in my own simplistic way, that at the end of the day, Strauss rejects Heidegger. But he does so with the utmost respect and without ever being dismissive. He says at one point, the only great thinker alive in our time is Heidegger. Just as another little anecdote, and I'll stop and let you respond to some of that. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I've heard this from more than one person. So let me back up and say one other thing. Strauss maintained a friendship to the end of his life with Alexander Kojève, Strauss called him basically a Stalinist. Read the debate on tyranny, where he talks about how Kojève is willing to take incredibly unpopular positions. But Strauss regarded him as the greatest philosophic exponent in his time, in their joint time, of rational historicism, of a kind of Hegelianism, but even made better and more profound by Kojève. And he did not hesitate to send students who are in Europe, says, go meet this man and talk to him. You need to hear this alternative, how profound it was. Similarly, I've heard from more than one student who studied directly with Strauss, who told Strauss, I'm going to be in Europe. And asked him, should I meet Heidegger? Is there anything I can learn from him? And Strauss said, again, anecdotal, I don't have firsthand confirmation of this, but I've heard it more than once. It's fine to go meet him, talk to him, and listen to him, so long as you don't shake his hand. Have you ever heard that?
I have, yeah. It's one of the first things I heard about Strauss and Heidegger. It made me want to learn more.
Yeah.
One of the things about the Schmitt case, and this applies to Strauss, it applies to Heidegger, it applies to other controversial thinkers living and dead. When somebody says, in a guilt by association spirit, that you can't read them without being tainted by their worst sins, that has the very convenient upshot of excusing one from having to do any real work. And I think that that's really the benefit for the accusers of these smear campaigns, is that they're an exercise in excusing laziness. They're certainly an act of intellectual malpractice. So the serious teachers like Strauss, they don't do that. They're not lazy, and they're not, another thing is that people who accuse, for example, Strauss, rather Schmitt, I would say more likely, and Heidegger, of being ideologues, their dismissal is much more ideological than anything Schmitt or Heidegger or Strauss ever wrote. So I think we have to be brutal in discarding that guilt by association argument when it comes to the serious study of serious thinkers. It's just not the case that to read something carefully means to agree with everything that's written in it. And it is the case that we need to think about big problems, which means we're going to have to think through thoughts that are not our own, and that may be against our own. Schmidt obviously is very important not only to liberals for his criticism of liberal constitutionalism. You want to see where you have weaknesses in your political theory and your system of political understanding, and he pointed some out quite brutally. He's been important for leftists who appropriated his thought and used it to attack liberals. He's important on the right. Clearly, there are right Schmittians who invoke the concept of the political, his rhetoric. He has readers in China and in Russia who are drawing on his thought. So it's just unthinkable that there would be that anybody serious would succumb to a smear campaign against him, and that anybody serious would wage a smear campaign against him. So that's my view on the Schmidt question. Just people who issue those kinds of accusations, they're not serious people. The underlying concern is legitimate. The worry that if you teach an anti-liberal thinker, you will persuade some students to become anti-liberal students. The risk involved in challenging your own presuppositions, the risk involved in calling the orthodox opinions into question is a real risk. And there may be times where you have to do some sort of civic duty campaign to dissuade people from studying. But if we're talking about what can be gained in thoughtful circles that aren't averse to risk, then everything's on the table.
Yeah, I mean, just to keep beating up on these people a little bit because they deserve it. I never hear anyone, not even serious Christians, tell me that I'm bad. I mean, I'm told I'm bad all the time for other things, but nobody ever says it's bad to read Machiavelli. That's just fine, right? Well, right, if we're going to take the moral impact of teaching completely seriously, Machiavelli is extraordinarily corruptive, at least potentially. Now, I happen to think he's profoundly philosophic as well, and I think that Strauss explains well what the purpose and meaning of the outrageous advice that he gives is. But he somehow gets a pass, despite arguing for slaughter in certain cases. Now, granted, Machiavelli's arguments for killing are they're quote unquote moderate, right? He's not advocating for genocide. He's in fact goes out of his way to talk about to differentiate cruelty well used from cruelty badly used, cruelty that is self-perpetuating and done for its own sake, whereas versus cruelty that is limited in scope and only done for the common good. But there still is an advocacy of violence, extra-legal violence, extrajudicial violence, even violence against people. If you read Discourses, Book 3, Chapter 1, with some care, people who are totally innocent and don't, because it's one thing to kill someone extra legally, but the guy did it and he's a bad guy, right? It's another thing to kill someone extra legally who didn't do anything, but whose death may somehow serve the ends of the state. And Machiavelli does recommend that. And yet it's okay, we can read him. And then, I mean, just to continue the pile on for a second, is there a more profoundly anti-liberal thinker than Plato? Now, it's an anachronistic question because there's no liberalism for Plato to respond to or to be against. But to the extent that Strauss is clear about anything, in his many writings on Plato, he makes it very plain that the specific recommendations that Plato makes politically, whether it be in the Republic, the Laws, the Statesman, or elsewhere, right, are not compatible with what we understand as a liberal understanding of human nature, of individual rights, and the proper structure of the state. And yet nobody gets blamed for reading Plato. That's just fine. So all of this is just, I think, rather silly, as you point out, but it's still useful to us to point out the hypocrisies and to beat this argument down, because I don't want it to gain currency and further constrain an already fairly constrained intellectual horizon in which we live.
Yeah, I want to say two quick things about that. The first is that there were thinkers who were appropriated by the left, like Schmidt, Nietzsche, and I think Heidegger as well. I would say most American Heideggerianism is left appropriated through the French channels. Maybe there is this idea that either Machiavelli is nobody takes him seriously enough to have him be politically relevant in the ways that you mentioned, or to the extent to which he justifies extra legal or extra moral actions. That's also helpful in the right circles, so a kind of quote unquote left Machiavellianism, for which, Machiavelli's amoralism would be useful, just like Schmitt's, Heidegger's, and Nietzsche's as they see it. But the interesting task in our circles, so to speak, I think, is the recovery of all of these thinkers back to where they belong, which is definitely not primarily on the left, and definitely not to be wielded against the right like they have been since, especially in the post-war consensus, the weak gods, like Reno called them.
Yeah.
So that's a big task there, I think, the rehabilitation. And some of that started, I guess, in 2016, and it's continuing now. But you're right. And about Plato, I just want to say anecdotally, as it were, not to get into the details and not to spread rumors, but for sure there are liberal professors who are, how could you put this, very afraid about the resurgence of a kind of right-wing anti-liberal political theory, and who are now starting to include Plato in the canon of censored thinkers. Like, they are raising red flags when they have student interest in Plato. So maybe there's a turning of the tide in a bad way, where you will no longer be looked upon as doing nothing overtly dangerous by studying Machiavelli or even by studying Plato.
Well, wow. Okay, I didn't know. I mean, I knew that Mark Zuckerberg's sister has it in for any kind of non-regime approved liberal use of the classics, and is alarmed that young men are reading the classics and deriving anti-liberal lessons from them. But I didn't know that this was as widespread as you just said in academic departments. That's not good.
I've heard that the classics as a field considers its struggle with the white supremacist use of classical thought to be a big deal. But independently of what's going on there with classics as a field, for sure in political theory, political philosophy, some people are starting to get worried that a contemporary revival of Platonic political philosophy, to use Strauss's term, or political Platonism, to use Alexander Dugin's term, poses a threat to the liberal modern values. And therefore, yeah, I've heard, like I said, anecdotally, someone I know was working on Plato's Laws, and there were all kinds of concerns that, you're a stone's throw away from fascism if you go down that road.
Oh, wow. So in other words, it's going to get worse before it gets better. No, that's, I guess, not surprising, and yet still kind of depressing. All right, I want to get now into, I'll just say, and you can react to, like, what Strauss means to me, or what I take from him, or how he informs my present politics. And I don't think we're going to, or at least I expect we're going to disagree about this, because, I'm from a specific school of Straussianism, the so-called West Coast Straussians, the followers of Jaffa. We can go into what that means and how it differs from the East Coast. But for present purposes, well, let's go back to Strauss's Natural Right and History, which I mentioned. Probably, if not his greatest book, which I think that honor goes to Thoughts on Machiavelli, it's his most famous book. And it's the book that most directly, while it is a philosophic book, it has an argument about the present day, much more so than many of his other books. Most of everything Strauss wrote appears to be a commentary on a classic text. And I say appears to be, it is a commentary on a classic text, but Strauss is using that genre, an established genre, to do other things. What does he say? You might even remember exactly where he says it. I don't remember, but he says something like, I think he says this of Maimonides, that he avails himself of the specific immunity of the commentator in order to present his own thoughts. In other words, if you present yourself as, I'm just telling you what this other book says, you can fool or mislead or hide from a lot of readers the fact that you're actually saying what you want to say in between the lines. Strauss does that in almost all of his books, if not all. Natural Right and History, he does it too, but it makes an argument more so and more explicitly than other books. And the argument is, there was this ancient understanding of natural right, that the fundamental the discovery of political philosophy in the Socratic era was the pointing out the inadequacy of all conventional accounts of justice in the ancient world. Whether you're an Athenian or a Spartan or a Roman or whatever, you think you know what justice is, you're acting on unspoken or at least unthought through presuppositions, which when examined turn out to be inadequate. And philosophy's, in a way, first response to the disclosure or revelation or demonstration of this inadequacy is to say, well, we've just shown that there is no right, right? So the conventional account of, justice and virtue is wrong, and there isn't an alternative account. And that the Socratic turn, this is Socrates' turn away from, not like a permanent turn away from investigating the natural things, because Xenophon and others point out he never gave up on that, but his shifting his focus to discussing the human things, the political things, good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, and so on, is an attempt to see if these concepts exist in nature. And the answer turns out to be yes. Okay. Now, I am one of those who believe that Strauss never, ever closes off a philosophic question. So he never says, I have refuted X and settled that, and established Y, right? He does say at one point, though, that awareness of the fundamental problems is ultimately incompatible with neutrality between the basic alternatives. A philosopher who studies these issues and thinks through all of the pros and cons, the arguments for and against, will incline himself to one or another typical solutions, but that inclination isn't settled knowledge. It doesn't close out the issue. However, if we were to say, which we shouldn't, but if we were to say that natural right in history makes an argument that closes out the issue, it is to say that the original Socratic understanding of natural right, that political phenomena exist by nature, that you can learn from nature what is the right or best way to live, and what is the preferable action to take in any given circumstance. You can learn that from nature. He says this is replaced later on by a notion of history, that all philosophic and political truth is contingent on the historical situation. And Strauss takes the side of natural right. And in fact, when he republishes the book in 1972, he adds a little preface in which he says, nothing in the meantime has shaken my inclination to prefer. Look at the way he puts that. His inclination, so he hedges it twice. It's just an inclination, and it's just a preference, right? But he still prefers natural right to history. And I begin from there. So all of my politics comes down to the natural right exists. I believe it exists, right? That it's knowable. We can learn from it, and we can use it as a guide to action. So to just take one contemporary issue right now, like my feelings on the Ukraine war, I don't think natural right compels the United States or the West or NATO to get involved in this war. I think natural right, in fact, tells against it. Now, natural right may demand, and I think it's plausible that it does demand, that invasions of sovereign territory are wrong and shouldn't be done. But it does not, on the back end, obligate other nations to get into such a war in a way that will prolong suffering and misery that is not conducive to those nations' national interests, and may in fact cause them to expend a great deal of blood and treasure in, at best, a non-productive way, and at worst, in a way that makes the war larger, longer, wider, and more catastrophic. So that's just one example. I'll just give one more quick one, right? If there is natural right and human beings have natural rights and liberty is a human good, then I don't see how COVID lockdowns and vax mandates can be justified. So these are just two ways that, Strauss informs my politics, and I throw them out there because those are two ways in which the so-called dissident right that we're talking about, we would agree with us. So I hope that at least one person listening realizes, so if you're learning from Leo Strauss can bring you to this position, well, maybe he's not, the neocon, whatever that we thought he was, who's the philosophic grandfather to the global neoliberal order that's eating the West presently. I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop now.
Yeah, something else that could appeal to the dissident right as far as Strauss goes, I think this is surprising. People wouldn't necessarily have this formulation in mind at the start. But if we look at Schmitt, for example, concept of the political, Schmitt clearly an anti-liberal thinker. He's criticizing liberalism from the right. He points out a lot of the shortcomings of liberalism that we are familiar with. I think its attempted neutralizations and things like that, the way that it tries to push the conflict between friend and enemy onto some other plane, and therefore it becomes much more radicalized, so that if you are not on our side, you're not just our enemy, you're subhuman, or you're, no longer even to be accounted for. So Schmitt's analysis and concept of the political is a very powerful lens through which to consider a right-wing criticism of liberalism. And then when Strauss comes along, reads it, and writes his notes on it, what does he say? That Schmitt is still too liberal, and that there is an additional step or two to take to radicalize even Schmitt's anti-liberalism. In other words, I think this is not at all intuitive or obvious or self-evident. Strauss, in his notes on Schmitt, comes to light as someone who's even more radically anti-liberal, or who at least pushes us in the direction of considering a more radical anti-liberalism than even Schmitt does. Whereas normally we would probably see it the other way around. Schmitt is the more anti-liberal thinker, Strauss is the more liberal democratic thinker. So we have a little bit of a puzzle because obviously on one plane of analysis, Strauss is the more moderate and friendlier of the two towards liberal democracy. But on another plane of analysis, he's not. He's the more radical critic, or you could say interpreter. He gets further into the roots of the issue. And that's what's always attracted me to Strauss when it comes to any particular question, whether it's a question of interpreting a certain author, or whether it's a question of making sense of a certain tendency or school. He drives us further to the root of the problem than most other thinkers do. He sees it more comprehensively, and he can penetrate the depths more profoundly. I think he has that in common with Heidegger. And I've always considered that Strauss did for the history of political philosophy what Heidegger did for the history of philosophy, showing the role and the place and the configuration of each thinker, or each, to use Heidegger's image, great mountain in the mountain range. So Strauss gets us to the depths, and I think, why would we prefer not to go there? He gets us to comprehensiveness. Why would we prefer to have a parochial, narrow outlook? So those are areas where he's absolutely indispensable. And at a more, let's say, at a more simple level, or at a level that's more, not simple, but related to specific contemporary political events and affairs, one of the areas that was most important for Strauss was the area of education. And I think we could look around and say that one of the areas where we're failing the next generation of students, I don't mean you and I, but I mean, right, the mainstream academic institutions, is in the area of education. Things are not just bad, they're abysmal. And so the possibility of a revival of a genuine liberal education, the possibility of reviving a course of instruction that is elevating and not degrading, that's ennobling and not vulgar, I think that is a huge, if that's all that Strauss had to offer, that would be more than enough. And obviously has much more to offer than that.
Yeah, I definitely. It's just about the best thing that ever happened to me is discovering him, and then being able not just to read his books, but to go and learn from people he taught directly and indirectly. I mean, it's just a miracle. The only thing better that could have happened is I used to say to people, if I found Aladdin's lamp, I'm not sure. I'll try to think through, my wishes. I know they should all be selfless ones, like world peace. Although if we read Strauss, we know that world peace is impossible. That is to say, a perfect harmony and a perpetual cessation of all wars. That's just never going to happen. But I would be tempted to rub the lamp and show up at the University of Chicago at, let's say, age 20 in 1949. But the lamp does not seem to be available, so I can't do that. I think you would agree with me on the following, but tell me if you don't, right? So you talked about Strauss's qualified support for admiration, maybe too strong a word, but let's say support for liberal democracy, which he definitely did express qualified support for. I say qualified because he's clear at times. He says we are not permitted to be, because we are friends of liberal democracy, we are not permitted to be flatterers of liberal democracy. In other words, we are obligated to point out its flaws. Now, in the fevered political environment of 2022, in which a phrase I have come to despise, quote, our democracy, unquote, predominates, it is believed that any criticism, any even friendly criticism of democracy means that you are fundamentally an anti-democratic person and bad and should be canceled. And that's unfortunately one of those things that's only getting worse. But Strauss was willing to criticize democracy and willing to read thinkers who saw its flaws, as we've already talked about. I would say that first of all, his preference for democracy over the then available alternatives. I mean, he says at one point, the superiority of democracy or of liberal democracy to communism is obvious enough, if you remember that line, and he just moves on. Doesn't even feel the need to state the case. Obvious enough, right? So it's superior flatly to any alternative that is presently practiced or that seems viable in the moment. Now, that's not high praise, right? Because a thing does not have to be great in order to be superior to something that's abysmal. He also says in Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, that one of the strengths of democracy is that by giving freedom to all, it gives freedom to those who care for human excellence. So Strauss is quite aware that he could not do what he did, both as a thinker, writer, and as a teacher. Because remember, you can get in trouble with communicating dangerous ideas to the young, as Socrates found out. But he had the freedom to think and write, and to teach students, and to carry on, to inculcate a love of and respect for and interest in philosophy. And we know that he inculcated that into many dozens of very, very talented people who keep it going to this day. And he had the freedom to do that. So those are two of his items on the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side, I think what Strauss was worried about is that by giving freedom to all, that what he didn't want was for liberal democracy, or the danger that he saw was that liberal democracy just becomes institutional or a mechanism for providing freedom, and then takes a kind of agnostic, standoff, detached position on what the freedom is to be used for, right? So a bad outcome is, yes, we all have freedom, but we forget or deny claims of natural right, claims of better and worse, higher and lower. And so the freedom, it just becomes the freedom to use it any way you want. So if all you want to do is sit on the couch and play video games, that's freedom, right? And he thought that, a liberal democracy completely detached from a notion of ends and a hierarchy of ends, which is something he speaks of, right? There is a hierarchy of ends. Some activities are of greater dignity and value and import than others. Some are merely necessary, some are done for their own sake. And he's getting all of this from the ancients. And the ancient philosophers make clear that this is the purpose of politics, is to promote virtue. They're not saying that that's actually done throughout the ancient world, but they're saying that's the right end for politics by nature. And the regimes that they propose, the regimes of Plato and Aristotle, right, Strauss says, cannot be ported easily or at all into the modern world. So what we need to do is find a compromise that is, we as political philosophers, I don't mean you and I, because Strauss was always very cautious about applying that term to himself. And if he didn't do it to himself, I think we shouldn't do it for ourselves. I always correct people when they say, when they call me a philosopher, I say no. But that's an aside. The point is, those who think about politics in the modern world have to think of a way to sort of preserve the goal of the ancient philosophers, which is the human flourishing in virtue, but outside the means that they recommended, which aren't practical in our time. And so for Strauss, perhaps the political problem for the political thinker and even actor in the modern world is, how do you preserve and promote human virtue in a fundamentally liberal regime with its ever-present temptation to be focused on process, procedure, and mechanism, and to be officially indifferent to what ends are pursued? I hope that made sense.
Yes, so that's all accurate for sure, and hugely important. And Strauss, he did say that, or suggest anyway, that liberal democracy and communism, just to turn back to that point for a minute, share the same end state. And I think he was concerned about the underlying political philosophy there, right? That this tendency towards universal, homogenous globalism of some kind is a threat to not only freedom, in both cases, global liberalism and global communism, a threat to freedom, but also a threat to the possibility of a philosophical life. And the philosophical life, I think, for him is the peak of human existence. And you don't want to have a political order, and certainly you don't want to have a global political order that makes the peak inaccessible. So yeah, it's a very real problem. And the question, I think, to a certain extent, for contemporary defenders of liberal democracy, however they see themselves, will take into account the possibility of some disagreements here and shades, variations, and so on, is what is the substantive goal of their political project? Is it still viable philosophically? Is it still viable politically? And there it's not so clear. I think it is necessary to take into account the global projects that oppose global liberalism. In other words, the defenders of some other regime. You see, because what I'm trying to say is we have the question of the organization of the regime as a domestic policy question, right? What's the best order internally? But as you mentioned with liberal democracy versus communism, we have to take into account that there was a bipolar world, then that there was the unipolar world, and now that we may be moving in the direction of a multipolar world or not. These kinds of considerations also cast their light on how we should think about the relationship between political theory and political practice, or political philosophy and politics, simply, in my view. And there, it's not just the question that you raised earlier, which is what is the status of America's involvement in Ukraine from the point of view of natural right, but we can generalize to a certain extent and say, what do global international political tendencies mean for the possibility of philosophical politics in the world? And the reason I mention that, I don't really want to go into a lot of detail on this, but I just want to raise it somehow peripherally. I assume some people who know me know that I do work on a Russian political philosopher named Alexander Dugin. And they may or may not know that Dugin is considered, with some disagreements, but somehow either to be influential on Putin's foreign policy, or at least to be looking in the same direction, but further ahead and able to say what is coming. And the reason I mentioned Dugin in relationship to Strauss is because there is a surprising number of parallels when it comes to the analysis of the importance of pre-modern political philosophy, of the classics, and things like that. And obviously, there are an equal number, if not more, disagreements and disharmonies between the two of them. But the fact that there should be another kind of philosophical supremacist in the world calling for a return to the study of political Platonism, whose return to the classics is also made possible, as it was for Strauss, through the study of Heidegger, and these kinds of parallelisms, I think it has the strange, intellectually curious benefit of directing our attention to what's going on intellectually elsewhere in the world. And on the question of East-West Coast Straussians, I'll just say briefly, again, this is anecdotal, it's personal, therefore in that sense it's irrelevant, but I figure I'd mention it anyways. East Coast Straussians, as a rule, I think, at least the ones that I've run up against, who treat Strauss more from the point of view of his interest in the classics than from the point of view of his relevance for any modern regime, including the American, they are pretty hostile, I think, to the consideration of foreign regime, like, a Straussian analysis of foreign regimes, like what, not the typical understanding of Strauss as a neocon who wants to spread liberal democracy around the world, but a completely different quote unquote Straussian approach to the study of global affairs, where you would, for example, try to understand Iranian political philosophy on its own terms, and other countries' political philosophy on their own terms. That's a piece of the puzzle that, in my view, is not very well represented by the existing East Coast Straussians. I'm not going to say anything about the others because I just don't know their works as well. And that should be there too, I think. Strauss paid attention to the global situation. And if we today operate under the assumption that we're still in the end of history and try to force all of our analysis of global and domestic political affairs into that framework, we may be missing something that's worth thinking through. And I want to quickly, Michael, I know there's a lot that I said and that I'm sure we can turn to in a minute, but I just want to go back for a minute and say two other things really briefly where I think Strauss is valuable. You'd mentioned that we're in, to a certain extent, and continuing to enter into a period of persecution of heterodox thoughts. There's always a persecution of heterodox thoughts. It's only a matter of degree. But to the extent that we're moving in that direction and continue to move into it, naturally, Strauss's thoughts on the art of writing and the art of reading remain as relevant as ever. So that's just another, people who are wondering whether or not to read Strauss. For sure, the issue of persecution in the art of writing remains a living issue. And another one, I always like to tell this because I think it's so amazing. I don't remember whether I mentioned it in our last conversation, so forgive me if I did. I'll be brief about it. But Strauss, when he was teaching, and you can find this in the Leo Strauss Center archives, a course on Marx in the 50s, I think it was, he made this really compact argument to his class. He said, Marx wants to overcome inequality. He wants to overcome, therefore, the division of labor as the source of inequality. And the source of the division of labor is the division into the sexes. Therefore, a coherent Marxist political and social policy would overcome man's division into the sexes, man's bisexuality, he calls it in his lecture. He means, obviously, the fact that humanity is split into male and female. And the class laughs at him because it's so outlandish to them that there could ever be an attempt to overcome the division into man and woman. And he says, don't laugh. And he's right. They shouldn't have laughed, because now it's not a laughing matter. Now it's the social policy. And we always have to be willing to consider, are there some laughable ideas now that a thinker like Strauss, if not Strauss himself, is indicating is going to happen in 20, 30 years if we continue on the trajectory that we're on. So that's just another thing where when you see Strauss say that, you're like, that would have been nice. If I could tell you that in the stock price of Nvidia, so that we can help with Nancy Pelosi's trades or whatever. If we knew where things were moving, then it would be helpful to know them. So if Strauss could tell us in the 50s that the logic of Marxism is moving towards the overcoming of gender difference, and they laughed and he didn't, that tells us something about what it means to see further than others, and to follow out a line of reasoning to its end. Why wouldn't we want that?
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to. I mean, I'm thinking, it reminds me of Book 5 of the Republic, where Glaucon and Adeimantus, their first response to Socrates saying that we have to treat the sexes equally in the guardian classes, they laugh at him.
Yeah.
Right? They laugh. It's and Bloom points this out in his commentary, like almost nothing could be more just palpably ridiculous to a Greek audience than this notion. Well, plus ça change, I guess. Regarding esoteric writing, just as a quick aside, I to me, it's one of the premier things I learned from Strauss. It frustrated me at first. It still frustrates me, but I get a lot more enjoyment out of doing the work of reading a book esoterically and discovering little things and putting two and two together. And I might also say that I'm occasionally asked why I personally have not yet been canceled. And one of the reasons is I learned how to do this from Strauss, not at the level to which he does it, to be sure, but learning it at all can be extremely helpful in one's career. As for Dugin, I admit I haven't read much. I've listened to a couple of interviews, including the one you did with him. But he's one of those, and I know you know this from personal experience, right? He's one of those to whom we're just not supposed to read. We're not supposed to pay attention to. Like, you're a bad person if you read him. And I never take that seriously. If anything, it makes people more interesting to me. There must be something to this if everybody is against it to that degree. In terms of Straussian analysis to foreign regimes, yeah, you're right. We don't do that. And I don't think my sect, the West Coast guys, really do much of it either. We had one in particular who was good at it, and that was Angelo Codevilla, and he unfortunately died in September of last year. So without him, we don't have anybody who does that. I will say I'm also no stranger to having paid attention to a book one is not supposed to read. When I reviewed, I think we talked about this, but I reviewed Bronze Age Mindset for the CRB, the Claremont Review of Books, in 2019. And there was a lot of just outrage that how can you take this seriously? How can you even touch it at all? It's a bad book, therefore you are a bad person. Well, one thing I will note is that the author of that book who writes occasionally, actually some of the most interesting things that he does from my perspective when I see his stuff appear is really give serious political analysis to foreign regimes in a way that myself, as an outsider to these regimes, I read that and I feel like I've learned something, and that not through some American, whether liberal or conservative ideological lens filtering it, just from a completely outside perspective, that, okay, you want to know how this regime or people here or this leadership really thinks and what's going on. I can't vouch for the accuracy of it, but I do find it interesting. And I think you're right that our sect in general needs to do more of that. And it's a failure. It's a pretty obvious gap that we don't do that.
I'll have to listen. I know he has his podcast. I've read his book naturally and your review. And I think I saw something in the New York Times today possibly about you in that review, if I'm not mistaken.
So just for the So on the day we're taping this, I never know when these things, there's post-production and so on. So there's usually a little bit of a gap before they get released. But on the day we're taping this, the New York Times Magazine released a long piece about the Claremont Institute, and long in the making. I mean, I don't know how long the writer spent on it. I talked to the writer probably 2 months ago now, maybe not quite two, but at least 6 weeks ago at some length. And a lot of people from our world talked to her. And so the piece is just out today, and it's kind of getting talked about in terms of, what the Claremont Institute is, what its intellectual influences are, and so on. So by the time this comes out and you hear this, the piece will have been out for a while, and it should be pretty well established out there. You could find it and read it on the web.
One of the things about BAP that I think forces us to turn. I mean, like, this is one way to see how we can be motivated to turn to Strauss, but not only Strauss, to these other German thinkers, is because, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's roughly fair to say that BAP has been at the forefront of a kind of revival of Nietzsche on the right. Is that,
Yeah,
you think, fair to say?
I think so. Sure.
So to that extent, it invites the right to think about the theoretical problems involved with adopting a Nietzschean perspective on politics and life. And so, at the very least, in my view, that means staging the conflict between Heidegger and Nietzsche, since after all, Heidegger had some things to say about Nietzsche, as well as Strauss and Nietzsche, because Strauss had been so influenced by him. He wrote about Zarathustra, obviously, and Beyond Good and Evil. And in my piece on German thought in America, the short one that you mentioned at the start of the program, that's where I said, if the right is going to be operating with some thinkers, and it looks like at least some of them, have either this direct, they're either Germans or they owe something to the German thinkers, then it's just an invitation for us not to sidestep the task of understanding what's really at stake among these thinkers, because they're not reducible one to the other. There are some curious points of overlap, some politically relevant and philosophically serious disagreements. And so I'm not suggesting nobody's doing it, but I think it still stands ahead of us as a real intellectual task. My particular inclination from my limited perspective is that even though there's a kind of recovery of Nietzsche on the right, the serious study of Heidegger on the right is still to come. And that's going to help us to understand what to make of Nietzsche. And BAP himself in Bronze Age Mindset, he mentions Heidegger disparagingly. So there are some invitations in the existing texts, not to mention, obviously, Strauss's views, which you cited earlier, that Heidegger is the only great thinker of our time. Clearly, Heidegger is of great relevance for Strauss. He's of great relevance for some right-wing anti-liberals outside of the United States. And he's probably, on Straussian grounds, at the very least, if we need the justification, the most serious reader of Nietzsche, or at least, if not the most serious reader of Nietzsche, let's, second place at worst, okay? There are people like Lawrence Lampert who write about Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Strauss very thoughtfully. But there's that whole realm that we kind of have to enter into, to the extent that we're really trying to think through the theoretical issues and their practical consequences. So although the recovery of Nietzsche on the right, I think, is it sounds kind of strange to say, but it's a positive step, because he'd been appropriated by the left, which is not where he belongs. Politically and philosophically, Nietzsche should not be ceded to the left. No, really, other great thinkers should be either. Although the left may be finding something of genuine worth in these figures that we might not see otherwise, still, they shouldn't be seated where they don't belong. So the recovery of Nietzsche is a positive step in that sense, but it's no substitute for actually thinking Nietzsche through and thinking through the other people who engaged with him at the highest level. And that's really what that short piece was about, where I'm suggesting we have to go back and forth between Strauss, Nietzsche, and Heidegger to really get the issues clear. It doesn't close the door on any questions about the status of the American founding. It doesn't close the door on the meaning of the American regime, but it does tell us, if we're going to be thinking in terms of vitality and life and will to power, if we're going to be following people who are Nietzschean in their outlook, we should be aware, at least there should be some people who are aware of the deeper problems.
Yeah, so I do want to come back to Strauss before we close it out, but while we're here, let's stay here for a second. I think, so I mentioned now twice, I'll say it again, I found Heidegger to be very hard to understand, whereas I'm not making a claim to understand Nietzsche, but I will make two claims. One, he's a lot easier for me to understand than Heidegger, and two, he's really fun to read. And I think that, yes, I would give back a lot of credit for reviving serious study of him on the right and on the young right, but but he also has that advantage, right? If you're, you remember that line, I know you do because I've seen you quote it, right, where Strauss says, I literally, between the ages of 22 and 30, I literally believed every word of Nietzsche's that I understood. But he specifies the age, right? That sort of prime moment when, philosophic curiosity and daring and that taste of the young, which Strauss says in Thoughts on Machiavelli, is not the best taste. In other words, a sort of enjoyment of shocking vulgarity. Not that Nietzsche's vulgar, but he's shocking and blunt and bold, right? There's none of that sober moderation that you get in Aristotle or Kant. It's exactly the thing that gets young people's blood pumping. So Nietzsche has that advantage: the writing style, the humor, the almost viciousness with which he attacks his philosophic and other enemies and dismisses stupid positions. Kids love that, and he's got that going for him. Now, my problem in what I've read, and I've read most, if not all, of Nietzsche, although not with the care, and I speak more hesitantly here just because I read nobody more than Machiavelli, read his books over and over again, never stopped reading them, and it only just impresses upon me the fact that I still don't fully understand him, and at my age, if I don't by now, I'm never going to. He's just that profound, right? And I think the same of Nietzsche, whom I've read even less, so I can't speak authoritatively to either one of these guys. My problem with Nietzsche is what I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong. This is a genuine question. This is my impression, but I want to know what you think of it. What attracts people on the right to Nietzsche is his, not just his refusal to go along with the liberal project, but all the torpedoes he puts into its waterline, and all of the ways in which he stands up for, to come back to an earlier point we made about Strauss, Nietzsche stands up for hierarchy, for differentiation, right? For better and worse, higher and lower, greater and lesser dignity, from the profound versus the trivial, and so on. He's an eloquent spokesman of achievement and greatness and everything high in the human spirit, and an eloquent denigrator of everything low or even mediocre, or certainly of making mediocrity the standard by which human life should be lived, or making philosophy and or politics indifferent to the question and just a matter of preference. Well, what do you like? Do you want to be a painter on the order of a Raphael and the great masters, or do you just want to take these watercolors and spread them around on a piece of paper with your fingers? And both are equally valid, and know who can judge, right? Nietzsche just torches that kind of thing. On the other hand, this is my biggest problem. I defend those hierarchies and those standards on the basis of natural right, as I learned it from Strauss and his students. And I think that is a rational, sensible foundation for those distinctions. Nietzsche rejects, at least in my reading, he rejects that foundation and basis as inevitably leading to the leveling that he decries around him. And he doesn't come up with anything else to justify his, to my mind, legitimate difference between better and worse, base and high, and so on. It just comes down to, therefore, an assertion on his part without a foundation. And I don't see how that isn't ultimately fatal to his thought. And at my read, Strauss reaches the same conclusion. And that's why Strauss says we have to go back to the ancients. We go back to the ancients and they provide the foundation without the leveling trap of where, the ditch that late modernity and historicism and philosophic relativism and positivism have led us. So, to me, if I'll close on this point, right? And this is a pretty conventional interpretation of Strauss, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? His view is there's a wrong turn taken somewhere in modernity. Nietzsche and Heidegger are reacting properly to the dead end of modernity, but they trace the roots of it back to Plato, back to Socrates, rather than to modernity. To them, they don't see a distinction between ancients and moderns. To them, the whole tradition is one line, not straight, it's zigzag, but a line that gets us to where we are. Whereas I, Strauss, see a break, and the break is on our salvation, because we can go back, at least philosophically, before it and recapture hierarchy, distinction, greatness, and flourishing without the baggage of liberalism.
Yeah, so I think all of that is right. I want to just add a couple of things. So the first one, Strauss's interpretation of Nietzsche in his teaching of Zarathustra. I mean, when Strauss taught Nietzsche Zarathustra, and when he writes about Beyond Good and Evil, and in particular, I think Lawrence Lampert's book on Strauss and Nietzsche is helpful here. It shows how, for Strauss, Nietzsche still has a kind of recourse, even after having rejected, as it were, natural right. He still has a kind of recourse to a substitute for nature, uh, served by the teaching of the eternal return. So, in Strauss's interpretation, Nietzsche still Platonizes ultimately, even as an anti-Platonic thinker. He Platonizes in his defense of nobility and his philosophical supremacism, and in his need to have something like nature, which he gets through eternal return. So there are some pretty nuanced and beautiful moments there in the interpretation of Nietzsche that are worth looking at through with Strauss's guidance. Something else, though, I wanted to say about Bap and Nietzsche as being exciting writers. That's absolutely true. It's pretty clear that younger people resonate with the fiery rhetoric, with the humor, and with everything else. Even we can call it, like you did, vulgarity at times, as long as it's a rhetoric that's in the service of something, which it is obviously in the case of both Bap and Nietzsche. But what I would like to suggest, which is counterintuitive, not the first thing that people would think about when they compare Bap and Strauss or Nietzsche and Strauss. Strauss is a hugely exciting writer and teacher. You just don't see it right away. And I think, just like it wasn't obvious that Strauss radicalizes Schmitt's anti-liberalism, like you would think, no, Schmitt's the more anti-liberal thinker. Strauss somehow flies under the radar there. I think he flies under the radar in terms of just how scintillating and how exciting a thinker and a writer he actually is, if you can just manage to get onto his wavelength, if you can just do the little moments of patient initiation that it requires to start to gain a taste for his writing and for his teaching. Strauss, and he, by the way, I know you know, but I'll say it in case other people don't. When he made some of his discoveries, he confided in letters that he was about to drop a bomb, so he knew that some of his discoveries were akin to a great explosion. They were akin to something very dramatic and drastic. And it's true that his presentation can seem subdued. It's true that it can be much less noisy and in your face than Nietzsche's or than that of some contemporary Nietzscheans, but it's well worth sticking with it to see what's truly revolutionary, radical, exciting, brilliant, and just incredible about it. That's Strauss in a way. I know he's been faulted. For example, Lawrence Lampert, this really left an impression on me when I read it. He's been faulted for being too moderate in his outward defense of philosophy. So moderate that people never make it through to what's truly exciting. A few people do. You found something in him that was exciting. I found something in him that was exciting. But it's not so easy. It doesn't just show itself to you at first glance. Whereas Heidegger is, you can turn to any page and be blown away almost immediately. So I would just counsel anybody who's thinking about turning to Strauss, who hasn't already experienced this, to take it on my word and maybe on your word that there is something exciting there, not less so than in Nietzsche, and maybe even more so.
Well, I love reading Strauss, and have almost from the first time I picked him up. I do see that he's not everyone's cup of tea. It's definitely not Nietzsche or Machiavelli. I mean, those are just writers where you start reading and you're laughing instantly and you're carried along. It isn't like that. There's a reserve to it. There's an almost, it's like shields up, in sort of sci-fi terms. He puts up walls to keep out people who are maybe easily bored, who are just looking to pull out quotes to sensationalize, and he makes you work. So a couple things. So I am an admirer of Lampert more than anything, based on, I haven't read the Zarathustra book. I should probably buy that. The two Plato books he wrote, I thought were just unbelievably great, really great. I mean, I learned a ton about how to interpret Platonic dialogues from how Socrates became Socratic. And I forgot the second one, the title of the second one, even though it's behind me. I could turn around and look. But the first one I read, though, way back when, was Leo Strauss and Nietzsche. And I was unconvinced by that. In fact, I came away rejecting the thesis, which, if I remembered, I only read it once, and this was in grad school in the 90s. Lampert seems to identify Strauss's position as Nietzsche's position, and to reject, now I may be wrong, but to reject what I just said to you before, that is that Strauss's critique of Nietzsche is not seeing the modern turn and therefore interpreting the present morass/malaise as an inevitable outcome of philosophy simply, not of modern philosophy. So I don't know if you think that's right or what, but that was my reaction to the book when I read it, whenever I read it in 95, 96.
I'd have to go back to tell you the truth on that particular point, the disagreement about the importance of the modern break and the modern turn. But what really left its impression to me was when he wrote about both of them ultimately defending above all, which I think is accurate enough. The philosophical life, the philosopher as the peak of, let's say, as one plausible peak of human existence, so as not to offend anybody, and that the relevant difference had to do with their rhetoric on that issue. So the secondary question, I mean, what to me, as I reflect on that reading, was the secondary question of whether they interpret differently the modern break. I'd have to revisit it. That's not what left its mark on me so much as the difference in rhetoric.
Yeah, okay. What you said about the eternal return was very interesting, and I'll need to go back and revisit that and think about it. That's the part of Nietzsche that I think I've always least understood or struggled with the most. But if that is, in fact, the substitute for nature or the stand-in or the thing that supplies the standard, because Nietzsche clearly has a standard, right? He's not a relativist, despite what, a kind of pop. And, it's worth, you talked about the left taking over certain thinkers. The man who really first popularized or even laid bare this notion was Alan Bloom in the famous chapter, The Closing of the American Mind, entitled The Nietzscheization of the Left and Vice Versa, right? All the way back in 1987. A book that had just a huge, huge impact on me. I mean, impossible to overstate what that book meant to me. Not when I first read it, because I didn't understand it when I first read it, but the second and third times when I read it in conjunction with other people, and we really struggled our way through it and got more of it. That was a life changer. Bloom makes that argument. He sort of initiates that argument, and his point is you can't make an egalitarian out of Friedrich Nietzsche, right? And the attempts to do so by the left have tortured his thought kind of beyond recognition and left us with a caricature that, again, to quote something you said earlier, the only way out of is to go back and do the work. You just have to go back to the original to see why this isn't true. But Bloom's now, and Bloom is now getting some criticism from our side a little bit. I want to think particularly I'll just name his name. I think because this is a fair. Darren Beatty, I know him. He's a friend of mine. I assume you know him. Wrote a dissertation on Heidegger for Duke University. And BAP have both made the point that Bloom's argument, there's a contradiction in a sense in Bloom's argument. On the one hand, Bloom is railing against relativism as having taken over our time. And on the other hand, he imputes this idea following Strauss to radical historicism, and he locates radical historicism in Nietzsche and Heidegger. But on the other hand, if you go back to let's leave Heidegger aside again, since I don't get it, but Nietzsche, right? There is a relativism in the sense that he denies a natural standard, I would say, or an implicit relativism, but there certainly is no surface relativism in the sense that Nietzsche is all about distinctions and hierarchies, better and worse, higher and lower, right? That's the antithesis of relativism, right? And so, in a way, the Bloomian narrative, which is a kind of pickup off the natural right in history narrative, if we may summarize as, and I'd certainly love to get your reaction to this, right? A more traditional Straussian view that for a long time, and maybe still is common on both the East and West Coast sects of Straussianism, was everything was going relatively fine in America until we imported this bad German thought. And then these German relativists corrupted us, and now we're all philosophically incoherent and just mired in the joyless quest for joy. That was a very common explanation for our spiritual melees for about 30 years. But how do you square that up with the very evident non-relativism that pervades Nietzsche? You know, I don't know. Yeah. Once you think it through at that level, the explanation starts to seem weaker, if you follow me. That old account starts to seem weaker.
Yeah, my approach to that would just be to say that the relativistic German thought does not reflect the correct understanding of Nietzsche's own teaching, but rather it's a weaponization by the left. So if we can correct for that, if we can correct for the weaponization by the left, then we can reconstruct what the teaching proper has to tell us. And it still might be anti-American. It still might pose many problems to the reigning state of affairs, to the key fundamental principles, to the traditions and institutions, and all of that. But at least we'll be seeing the real thing, you know, and not its distorted version. So I think the relativism, like, okay, I have a phrase that I use to encapsulate the leftist interpretation of Nietzsche, which is when slaves read Nietzsche. In other words, it was the slave morality that weaponized Nietzsche's account of will to power against the, you know, to the right. They turned the weapon to the right to say, oh, you're talking about truth? Well, you don't actually care about truth, you care about power. Oh, you're talking about nature, human nature, natural right, essences, hierarchies. You're not actually talking about those things. You're just instituting new systems of exclusion and power. So there's a combination of that kind of turning Nietzsche's weapons against him and against others on the right by unmasking any claim to truth as a claim to power, combined with a kind of rhetoric of relativism. But none of that is true to Nietzsche himself, properly speaking. So this, for me personally, and Bloom was a big figure for me as well. When I read that chapter on the Nietzscheanization of the left, it quickly occurred to me that there could have been a Nietzscheanization, a Heideggerianization of the left, which made possible the intellectual project of a recovery of Heidegger that corrects for that distorting effect, which is how I learned about, you know, Russian Heideggerianism and things like that, and started triangulating to understand Heidegger better. But the thing that we have to do is correct for the distorted field of interpretation that we have as a function of the leftist incorporation of these thinkers and the liberal unwillingness to read them. If you combine those two things, you see that there's been basically a vacuum where there should be substantive thought. There's been not the proper engagement with the principal sources of right-wing anti-liberalism for understandable reasons. But that distorted field of interpretation must be corrected, even if only to continue to defend liberal constitutionalism. You still have to correct the distorted field of interpretation. And that means putting Nietzsche and these other thinkers back where they belong, reading them through and seeing what we can learn from them. So that's how I square that. Was Nietzsche a relativist? No. So why does Bloom blame relativism on Nietzsche? Because of the leftist appropriation.
Yeah, that's fair, I think. I'd have to go back and reread that book. I haven't read it in a long time, but it since I read it young enough, it really stuck with me. So I think I remember it more clearly than some other books I've maybe read more recently. But what you just said is a good way to get back to Strauss, right? Correcting the distortion. So here's one distortion that I want to correct, right? When people call Strauss a neocon, yes, it's because of James Atlas and it's because of Paul Wolfowitz and Bill Kristol, however unfairly all of that is meant, right? But if they have an underlying thought beneath the charge, and some do and most don't, but some do, it is that they see in the concept of natural right a kind of universalism that fuels neoconservatism, especially neoconservative foreign policy, and that is corrosive to localism, tradition, borders, distinctions, differences in culture, difference in approach, you know, and so on. Now, this is sort of maybe tricky to express, but I don't think it's that tricky in thought. I don't think Strauss is in this sense any different than Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, right? So you've said several times today, and you said it the last time, and I completely agree with this, that, you know, Strauss is a philosophical supremacist. That is to say, he sees the highest type of man as the philosopher. although he never quite says that, he poses it usually as dichotomies. Is it the philosophic or the political life, the philosopher or the poet, the philosopher or the man of faith? And he makes strong cases in favor of all of them. But my read between the lines is that at the end of the day, he uses the specific immunity of the commentator to say that for Plato and Aristotle, the philosophic life is the peak. And slightly more between the lines, it's indicated that Strauss agrees with Plato and Aristotle. Okay. It's impossible to disentangle that insight, if you believe it's true, or argument or allegation if you have your doubts, characterize it how one wishes. It's impossible to disentangle that from a notion of universalism, right? Even Strauss, as he says, the proper subject of political philosophy is the best regime. And he says in a letter somewhere, I truly do believe that there is one best regime that's simply the best, in all times and places. It doesn't mean it's always practicable, always implementable, or always fit in a given circumstance or for a given people, right? But if we're going to have this hierarchy of ends, then there's a universal standard by which to judge it. But Strauss never, ever, despite that admitted philosophic universalism, never backs away from the notion that politics itself is always going to be particular. There's always going to be borders. There's always going to be separate societies. There are always going to be separate traditions. The separate nations are going to have different characteristics. And not only is this inevitable, I can point you right back to Book 2 of Plato's Republic, where even the just city and speech, the best regime, the most abstract best regime ever devised by a human mind, has a border and distinguishes between citizen and non-citizen, right? Plato is not trying to come up with one world government. So even there, but it's inevitably going to happen. And Strauss says, this is a good thing. Diversity, not the way a modern HR commissar would use it, but the way, the dictionary would mean it, right? Actual differences in thought, approach, and culture are valuable to the human race and give it character and shades of meaning and such. And the universality would be a disaster, would be, in a way, as you said earlier, the death of thought, the death of philosophy. The worst thing that could happen to philosophy was the imposition or implementation of one world government along an allegedly rationalistic premise. Would almost obviate not only all thought, would persecute all thought as being anything that questioned its alleged rational basis. We're kind of seeing this now, where you can't question the experts, right? Questioning a so-called expert on any question is proof of one's insanity. That reminds me of that remark somewhere in Nietzsche that the man, the last man, when he differs from orthodoxy, voluntarily checks himself into an insane asylum. So to bring this back to the point I'm trying to make here is, while Strauss is at his highest flown philosophic level a kind of principled universalist, at the practical level, he knows that particularism is always going to be part of human nature, and he thinks that's a good thing, right? So, in other words, I'm making the bold claim now that Leo Strauss would be and was, in fact, against globalization. Read the restatement on Xenophon's Hiero. He doesn't use any of our modern terminology, but he sees where this is going. And basically, avant la lettre, he's taking a stand against globalization.
Yes, I think that's right. Leo Strauss is an enemy of the open society. He's not a universalist. He's not a globalist. So the task is to avoid two temptations or two exaggerations, to see him as only universalistic or politically universalistic because he has this philosophical universalism of the best regime, not keeping those two things distinct and putting the emphasis on universalism. That's an error. And at the same time, seeing his defense of the closed community, of the smaller regimes of borders and all the rest of it, assuming that therefore there's no universal aspect to him. So going in the direction of particularism. He's able to preserve the right balance between the universal and the particular because he understands the nature of political things philosophically. And that's where you get that 1 foot in and 1 foot out, the city and man, philosophy and law, what you can do theoretically, what you can expect practically. The standard, the sort of utopian standard on one hand that guides your practical and prudent decisions, and the situation on the other. And so I think, one of the reasons why he criticized Burke, among others, I would say, is it collapsed too much into the particular and left the theoretical without its dues. And for sure, anybody who thinks that Leo Strauss is a neoconservative, liberal, universalist, global liberal Democrat is just way off. I repeat, the much simpler formulation to begin to understand him correctly is that he's an enemy of the open society, if that's helpful. And for sure, he is a Socratic. When I teach Strauss, I almost always accidentally say Socrates instead of Strauss. You could helpfully see Strauss as the reincarnation of Socrates, if that's a helpful formulation for anybody. It's got nothing to do with neoconservatism. It's got not only nothing to do with universalism, but it's anti-political universalism for all the reasons you said. I also strongly recommend people read the passages that you pointed them to. It's just not a viable interpretation of his thought to impute to him any kind of political universalism, period.
So, what other, and we can maybe see how far this question takes us, but end here otherwise. What other, dissident right, new right mischaracterizations of Strauss or Strauss's thought do you think are out there that we ought to be pushing back on?
Well, one that I see, although I wouldn't say that I go into it in great detail, is that he's he's Jewish foreigner in America pushing anti-American, anti-Christian thought onto an unsuspecting and gullible public, and that everything that he's doing is a kind of tribal smokescreen and, anti-Christian, anti-Anglo, and anti-American. Now, whenever I've plugged my nose long enough to read the people who make those arguments, which I have done before, I don't find them particularly compelling. I don't think that you can make that case about Strauss, that what's most important to him as a writer, as a thinker, as a citizen, as an analyst, as a historian, as a scholar, as an interpreter, is his Jewishness. That is pretty preposterous. However, it is true, I think, that he opened up the possibility of a intellectually defensible religious life for many, not only Jews, but also Christians, and presumably also Muslims and members of other faiths. I know that there are Christian thinkers who credit Strauss for opening the door, once again, to the possibility of revelation, to showing that there had never been a decisive refutation of the possibility of revelation. For sure, there are Jewish thinkers who credit him with that. One of them, David Novak, was on my dissertation committee, and he dedicated his last book, I think, or at any rate, credited Strauss with helping him to see that kind of thing. So Strauss, that he taught us something about the Jewish tradition is important. That he had a defense of Israel, as you mentioned, is important. That he got us to think at all about the possibility of biblical revelation and of pre-modern texts and of medieval texts. Just think about his incredible accomplishments in the field of medieval political philosophy and the study of these medieval texts. All of that is true, but to just reduce all of that to some caricatured version of, an anti-Christian, anti-American Jewish foreign agent or something like that is pretty preposterous. But that idea does circulate in some circles on the right, from what I can see and from what I can tell. And it's probably the same problem as the earlier one, a problem of actually not just doing the work, not reading the text, not thinking them through, not giving credit where it's due, and not seeing things as they are. So that's one, I think, big mistake. Another one is, you'd mentioned earlier, precisely because we're friends of liberal democracy, we can't be its flatterers. There may be the mistake that doesn't impute to Strauss any sort of a Jewish motives, doesn't impute to him universal neoconservative foreign policy ideas, but does suggest that to the extent that he's a defender of liberal democracy, he's not radical enough in understanding its limitations or the alternatives to it. I think you and I have covered some of that ground pretty well in this conversation, that, yeah, he's very well aware of alternatives to liberal democracy, of their merits and demerits, and of what's viable for us here and now. Now, our situation is not his situation, so we have to update the coordinates to a certain extent. Something that he thought was impossible, maybe we think is possible, and vice versa. The situation has changed. There's no Soviet Union, for example. So that's there for sure. But I think, if you read Strauss, you're a supporter of going to war with Iraq. If you read Strauss, you're a sort of, Jewish underminer of Christian America. that kind of thing. Those are probably the roughest characterizations of him that I've seen on the dissident right. I don't think they really bear, they don't bear weight. One other one is that Strauss and the people who take him seriously, like myself and like you, are too theoretical. It's over intellectualization. It's not enough direct action or something like that. Like you're not going to find what you need to deal with the problems of contemporary global liberalism or contemporary American democracy by reading Xenophon, or by reading Husserl, who Strauss also wrote about. So I don't think that's right either, obviously. But those are, I think, the major types of criticisms that I've seen on the right of Strauss and a serious engagement with him. In my view, I don't know the history of this question that well. Okay, I don't know all of the schools who are contesting for and against Strauss. I mean, I know a little bit about it, but I don't know it exhaustively. I'm sure you know it much, much better. But I will say that in my own experience as a teacher, in my own experience running Millerman School and having students come to me who are curious about political philosophy, about understanding the world we're in, about understanding our time and place, there is an appetite for Strauss and his tools of analysis, for his points of reference. In fact, later today, I'll be teaching Strauss and his commentary on Aristophanes' Clouds to a young guy who came to me for that. So however much opposition there might be in some parts of the dissident right towards Strauss, I think there's increasingly a recognition, I would expect this to grow, that he's not reducible to neoconservatism. He's not reducible to some sort of Jewish anti-American, anti-Christianity. And that, in fact, we still have a lot to learn from him. So I'm optimistic about the future of Strauss's reception on the right.
Well, one thing I would bring up that is in keeping with what you were just talking about is, Strauss, as a young man, was a very ardent Zionist. Now, I say as a young man because he never repudiated Zionism. It became less and less a focus of his thinking as he moved more into pure philosophy, textual commentary, and that kind of thing, right? But that's interesting because, look, what is the young right? The young right is a very nationalist populist, right? Well, what is Zionism in a way, if not a nationalist populist movement, right? And I mentioned Tom West earlier. West is interested in this and has begun studying. I haven't talked to him about where this has led him. It'll be interesting to see, but he says he wanted to go back and look at Strauss's early Zionism, his early Zionist writings, and see what the arguments were. And his initial finding, I know, was that they sound a lot like a lot of populist arguments and nationalist arguments being made today, right? There's another, I think, amusing story I heard that when Strauss was a youngish man in his 20s, he spoke to one of the premier, actually politically active Zionists of his time, said, Strauss says to this guy, I forgot his name, I'm sorry. It wasn't Herzl. It wasn't somebody of that, quite at that level, but way up there in the hierarchy. And he says, well, my young friends and I were all very, very interested in Zionism, and we believe this is the future for our people. And the guy says, well, what are you doing about it? He says, well, we were studying Strauss starts listing all the books that they're reading and studying. And the Zionist says to Strauss, asks him, are you doing any like survival training, any target practice, marksmanship, military drilling? And Strauss had to say, no. And he says, I realized at that moment that we weren't fundamentally serious. That is to say, right, the books are important, as you said, but if it never comes from the page into action, the man of action has something to say in these realms. Anyway, that's just my way of saying to those who may be listening on the young right, who are skeptical of Strauss or even hostile to him without knowing what he's all about, and who might even be hostile with him precisely because of his Zionism. Think through what that really means, though, in the context of his time and in the context of the larger issue, and you'll see that there's real value there.
Yeah, I'd like to just,
we're all trying to accomplish and and the challenges we face in our time.
There's those early Zionist writings, they're not necessarily so easy for someone who just doesn't know some of the background to pick up and read, but they display a tremendous polemical force. And polemics is also a kind of practical action. And Strauss was for sure very much in all of the relevant debates, and he was taking shots in a very thoughtful and effective and powerful way. You can tell, I think, when you read those early Zionist writings, how much of a genius Strauss was and how great his writing and speaking and polemical abilities were, in my view, and his analysis. So I think you are exactly right about this. And the early Zionist writings, by the way, are not the only example. The living issues in German post-war philosophy and other things where we can take some issue that Strauss cared about and was writing about, for example, the disputes among the Zionist circles, and say, how can we, what can we learn about populist national debates, and what is there valuable to emulate or to mimic in not only his style, but his substance as well? So the reason I mentioned the German living issues in German post-war philosophy is because in my view too there, even though that was written, I guess, 1941, it's not behind us, it's ahead of us. The United States and the intellectual circles, we're going to be repeating some of the disputes that have already taken place elsewhere at a pretty high level. And so if we can familiarize ourselves with the contours of the kinds of culture war or intellectual circle debates that have taken place, whether it's the early Zionist writings, whether it's the post-war German philosophy, it'll be another way to kind of see in advance how things are going to shake out or how they might play out, and how you can take shots where you need to take them, and how you can position yourself in respect of the other schools. Heidegger, he has this phrase that I really like. He says, the Greeks are so far advanced compared to us that our job is not to return to them, but to catch up to them. And somehow I think that's true as well of Strauss and his polemics against the other schools and movements. We're not turning back to Strauss. We're just trying to catch up to him.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end it. I remind everyone that I am Michael Anton of Hillsdale College. My guest has been Michael Millerman of the Millerman School, where you can learn more about the topics we discussed here and many others. In fact, the school, I would say, is laser focused on the topics we discussed here. And this has been a production of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy.